On April 10th, 2026, 4 astronauts travelled farther from Earth than any human being in history. 252,756 miles. They came home to a perfect splashdown, a standing ovation, and a NASA administrator declaring the path to the lunar surface officially open. But here is what almost nobody is talking about. The heat shield that protected them was never actually fixed. The radiation they absorbed exceeded every model NASA had, and the next mission, the one that was supposed to land on the moon, just got quietly downgraded to a test flight. Tonight, we're going to look at what Artemis II really proved about our future in space. And if you find that question as fascinating as I do, subscribe to the channel, get comfortable and settle in, because the answer is not what you expect. Let's get into it. Part 1. Splashdown. On April 10th, 2026, at 7 minutes and 27 seconds past midnight Universal Coordinated Time, which was 5:07 in the evening on a Friday in San Diego, a spacecraft named Integrity hit the surface of the Pacific Ocean about 40 miles off the California coast. It came down under 3 enormous red and white parachutes, dropped the last stretch at roughly 20 miles per hour, and made contact with the water so close to the target coordinates that recovery teams later measured the error at less than a mile. NASA called it a perfect bullseye, and by every measurable standard they were using, that is exactly what it was. The 4 people inside that capsule, Commander Reed Wiseman, pilot Victor Glover, mission specialist Christina Koch, and Canadian Space Agency astronaut Jeremy Hansen, had just completed a 10-day journey that covered 700,237 miles. They had accelerated to a peak velocity of 24,664 miles per hour, which is roughly Mach 32, roughly 32 times the speed of sound, roughly fast enough to cross the entire continental United States in about 6 minutes. At their farthest point on April 6th, they were 252,756 miles from Earth. That is more than 4,000 miles farther than the Apollo 13 crew travelled in 1970, which had been the record for the farthest any human being had ever been from home. It had stood for 53 years. It lasted 10 days against Artemis II. The recovery operation went smoothly. Navy divers attached a tow line. The capsule was hoisted onto the deck of the USS Portland. The crew emerged to applause, to camera flashes, to the kind of celebration that only happens when something genuinely historic has been accomplished. And it was genuinely historic. There is no hedging that. For the first time since December of 1972, when Gene Cernan climbed back into the Apollo 17 lunar module, and humanity left the moon for what turned out to be half a century, human beings had travelled beyond low Earth orbit, beyond the Van Allen radiation belts, beyond the protective magnetic bubble that shields every other person on this planet from the full force of the cosmos. 4 people went out there. 4 people came back. That is not a small thing. The recovery operation itself was a complex choreography. Navy divers were in the water within minutes, attaching the initial tow line to the capsule. Helicopters circled. Cameras broadcast the scene live to an audience of millions around the world. The whole operation, from splashdown to the moment the crew stepped onto the deck of the Portland, took several hours, a carefully orchestrated sequence designed to minimize risk to the crew and maximize the integrity of the spacecraft for post-flight analysis. Every action was documented, every step was filmed. Because this spacecraft, this particular capsule, with its heat shield and its service module and its life support systems, was about to become the most studied piece of hardware in the Artemis program. Its heat shield, especially, was about to tell a story that the splashdown itself could not. NASA Associate Administrator Jim Free stood in front of the cameras and said something that was clearly meant to be the headline. "The path to the surface is open now," he said. He called Integrity an incredible test of an incredible machine. And the media coverage was, almost universally, a story of triumph. Mission accomplished. America is going back to the moon. The future of human spaceflight is here. And I want to be clear about something before we go any further tonight. That story is not wrong. Artemis II was a success. The crew is safe. The mission objectives were met. The data is being collected. I am not here to tell you it was a failure because it was not. Think about what those numbers mean for a moment. 700,000 miles. That is almost 3 times the distance from the Earth to the Moon. It is farther than any human being has ever travelled from the planet that made them. And the crew did it with a flight path angle that hit its target within 0.4%. Imagine throwing a ball from Los Angeles and hitting a quarter on the ground in New York and being off by less than the width of the quarter. That is the precision NASA achieved with a capsule weighing roughly 26,000 pounds, hurtling through the atmosphere at 32 times the speed of sound. The engineering is extraordinary. That is not in dispute. Victor Glover became the first black astronaut to fly beyond low Earth orbit. Christina Koch, who already held the record for the longest single spaceflight by a woman, 328 continuous days aboard the International Space Station, added farthest woman from Earth to her resume. Jeremy Hansen became the first Canadian to travel beyond low Earth orbit, and only the second non-American to leave the Earth-Moon system. Commander Reed Wiseman, a Navy test pilot who had previously spent 165 days aboard the ISS, led the crew through a mission that read like a checklist of firsts. On April 6th, the crew experienced something that no human being in history had ever seen. They watched a solar eclipse from behind the Moon. For 53 minutes, the Earth blocked the Sun while the crew floated in Orion on the far side of the Moon, and they watched the solar corona extend outward from the eclipse disk for what one crew member described as more than 10 solar diameters, streamers of plasma arcing out into the blackness like, in astronaut Jeremy Hansen's words, baby hairs. Christina Koch photographed the lunar limb topography against the corona, producing images that planetary scientists will study for years. It was beautiful. It was unprecedented. It was the kind of moment that justifies the entire enterprise of human spaceflight. And on that same day, during that same eclipse, something else happened that was less photogenic but perhaps more important. The crew observed 5 to 6 flashes of light on the darkened lunar surface, meteoroid impacts, chunks of space rock slamming into the Moon at velocities of up to 70 kilometers per second, and they watched it happen in real time from orbit. Victor Glover reported one near the South Pole, close to the planned site for the future Artemis base camp. I covered those observations in a previous video on this channel, and what they revealed about the bombardment environment at the Moon is genuinely sobering. But tonight, those impact flashes are just one more piece of the picture we are assembling. One more data point in the story of what Artemis II actually told us about our readiness to go further. Because here is the thing about a perfect bullseye splashdown, about broken distance records and unprecedented solar eclipses and standing ovations on the deck of a Navy recovery ship. Those are the moments that make the news. Those are the images that go on the front page. Those are the things that NASA's Public Affairs Office is designed to amplify, and they should be amplified because they are real and they are remarkable. But they are not the whole story. They are not even the most important part of the story. The most important part of the story is the part you have to look for, the part that shows up not in press conferences, but in post-flight inspection reports and dosimetry data and engineering change requests and independent safety panel assessments. The part that does not come with a standing ovation. But I am here to tell you that there is a second story underneath the first one, and it is a story that almost nobody is telling. Because if you look carefully at what actually happened during those 10 days, at the engineering decisions that preceded the mission, at the data that came back, at the systems that failed, at the institutional patterns that shaped every choice NASA made, you start to see something that the celebration is not designed to show you. You start to see a gap between what we say we are ready to do in space and what we are actually capable of doing safely. A gap between our ambitions and our engineering, between our timelines and our technology, between the press conference and the post-flight inspection report, and that gap, the distance between the story we tell and the reality underneath it, is not new. It has appeared before in the history of human spaceflight, and the last 2 times it appeared, people died. So tonight, we're going to do something that the coverage of Artemis II has mostly avoided. We're going to look at the mission not as a story of what went right, but as a diagnostic, a stress test, a 10-day window into how prepared humanity actually is for the next century of space exploration. We are going to talk about a heat shield that was never fixed, about radiation that exceeded every model, about a pattern that stretches back 40 years and has a name that most people have never heard. We are going to follow the data where it leads, even when it leads somewhere uncomfortable, because the terrifying truth that Artemis II just confirmed is not that space is dangerous. We already knew that. The terrifying truth is that we might not be ready to be honest about how dangerous it actually is, and that the way we handle that dishonesty has, historically, been lethal. If that is the kind of question that fascinates you, or the kind of story you want to fall asleep to, knowing that someone is thinking carefully about the things that matter most, then this is where you belong. Get comfortable. This one builds slowly, and where it ends up is somewhere I genuinely did not expect when I started researching it. Let us start with the part that looked perfect, because the cracks, and I mean that literally, are hiding right underneath the surface. Part 2. The heat shield. The heat shield on the Orion spacecraft is made of a material called avcoat. It is an ablative thermal protection system, which means it is designed to absorb the heat of re-entry by slowly burning away, charring, melting, vaporizing layer by layer, carrying thermal energy away from the spacecraft as it goes. Think of it like an ice cube absorbing heat from a drink. The ice disappears, but the drink stays cold. Avcoat is the ice cube between the crew and the roughly 2,760 degrees Celsius of superheated plasma that forms around a spacecraft re-entering Earth's atmosphere at Mach 32. The theory is elegant. The reality, as it turns out, is much more complicated. Because in November of 2022, when NASA flew the uncrewed Artemis 1 mission around the Moon and brought the Orion capsule back through the atmosphere, something went wrong with AV coat. Not catastrophically wrong, not mission-ending wrong, but wrong enough to stop the entire program in its tracks for months, while engineers tried to figure out what had happened. Let me take you through what re-entry actually feels like, because I think it matters for understanding why the heat shield question is not academic. When Orion hit the upper atmosphere at roughly Mach 32, 24,661 miles per hour, the air in front of the capsule could not get out of the way fast enough. It compressed, it heated, and within seconds the spacecraft was surrounded by a sheath of ionized plasma, a fireball essentially, with exterior temperatures reaching approximately 2,760 degrees Celsius. That is hot enough to melt steel, hot enough to melt titanium, hot enough to melt almost anything that human beings know how to make. Inside the fireball, the crew could see orange and pink light streaming past the windows. They could feel the deceleration pressing them into their seats, multiple G-forces sustained as the atmosphere grabbed the capsule and slowed it from interplanetary speed to something survivable, and they could not talk to anyone. The plasma sheath that surrounds a re-entering spacecraft is electrically charged. Ionized gas is a conductor, and it blocks radio signals completely. For several minutes during the most dangerous phase of the entire mission, the crew of Artemis II was completely cut off from mission control. No voice, no telemetry, no data. Just 4 people inside a burning capsule, trusting that the AV coat heat shield between them and 2,760 degrees was doing its job. That blackout is not a malfunction. It is physics. It has happened on every crewed re-entry since the earliest days of the space program, but understanding it helps you understand the stakes of the heat shield conversation. During those minutes of radio silence, there is nothing that anyone on the ground can do. There is nothing that the crew can do. If the heat shield fails, there is no alarm, no warning light, no emergency procedure. There is a plasma breach, a structural failure, and a loss of vehicle that happens faster than human reaction time can process. The engineers who designed Avcoat understood this. The engineers who investigated the Artemis I char loss understood this. The engineers who developed the modified re-entry trajectory understood this. Every person in the chain of command who signed off on flying Artemis II with the AV coat workaround, rather than a redesigned heat shield, did so with full knowledge that if they were wrong, the failure would be total, instantaneous, and unrecoverable. There is no partial heat shield failure. There is working and there is not working, and the line between them is measured in material integrity at temperatures where most materials cease to exist. So when I tell you that NASA chose to modify the trajectory rather than redesign the material, I want you to understand the weight of that decision. It was not made casually. It was made by serious people with serious expertise who genuinely believed, and may be entirely correct, that the modified trajectory eliminates the gas-trapping failure mode that caused the Artemis I char loss. But it was also a decision made under immense schedule pressure, with billions of dollars and years of institutional momentum pushing toward a launch date, with the Chinese space program advancing steadily and congressional patience wearing thin. The technical merits of the decision may be sound. The institutional environment in which the decision was made is exactly the kind of environment that Diane Vaughan documented in her research, and we will come back to that because the parallels are not subtle. When the recovery teams pulled the Artemis I capsule out of the Pacific and brought it back to NASA's facilities for post-flight inspection, they found damage. A lot of damage. More than 100 locations on the heat shield where the AV coat material had not ablated smoothly as designed. Instead, it had cracked. It had spalled. Chunks of charred material had broken away in fragments, leaving divots and pockmarks across the surface of the shield. In some places, the char layer had peeled off in sections large enough to create a visible trail of debris behind the spacecraft during re-entry. Now here is why that matters, and why NASA spent the better part of a year and a half investigating it. The heat shield is not optional. It is not a backup system. It is not a nice-to-have. It is the single thing standing between 4 human beings and the kind of thermal environment that destroyed the Space Shuttle Columbia on February 1st, 2003. If AV coat fails, truly fails, not just cracks but burns through, the heat of re-entry reaches the aluminum alloy structure of the spacecraft, and what happens next is what happened to Columbia. The vehicle breaks apart. The crew does not survive. There is no escape system for re-entry. There is no abort. There is no plan B. The heat shield either works or it does not. So NASA investigated. They pulled approximately 200 AV coat samples from the Artemis I shield at Marshall Space Flight Center in Alabama. They ran tests. They modeled. They debated. And after months of work, they identified the root cause. The problem was gas. During the skip re-entry trajectory that Artemis I flew, a technique where the capsule dips into the upper atmosphere, skips back up briefly, then plunges down again for final descent. There was a phase between the dips where external heating rates dropped, while internal temperatures in the AV coat material remained extremely high. Gases produced by the normal ablation process became trapped inside the material because the outer char layer was not permeable enough to let them vent. Pressure built up. The char cracked. Pieces broke off. And here is the detail that makes this story genuinely fascinating from an engineering standpoint. When the investigation team looked closely at the Artemis I shield, they found that certain localized areas of AV coat that happened to be more permeable before the flight, areas where the material could breathe essentially or it did not experience any cracking or char loss at all. The gas vented through those areas naturally, no pressure built up, and the ablation process worked exactly as designed. The fix, in other words, was staring them in the face. If the entire shield had been permeable, the problem might never have occurred. There is a detail about AV coat's history that adds an uncomfortable layer to this story. Avocoat was originally developed for the Apollo program in the 1960s. It was used on every Apollo command module that re-entered Earth's atmosphere, including the ones that returned from the Moon. The Apollo capsules re-entered at similar velocities to Orion, roughly 25,000 miles per hour, and the AV coat performed well. But the formulation used on Orion is not the same as the one used on Apollo. The manufacturing process changed. The original Avicoat was poured into honeycomb cells as a single batch, cured in place, and machined smooth. The version used on Orion's heat shield was manufactured using a different process. Individual blocks of Avcoat fitted into a honeycomb carrier structure. The differences in manufacturing may or may not contribute to the permeability issue that caused the Artemis I char loss. But it means that when NASA says we used AV coat on Apollo and it worked, that statement is true in a general sense and potentially misleading in a specific one. It is the same material in name. It is not the same material in manufacture. But here is where the readiness gap enters the picture. Because NASA did not make the entire shield permeable, they did not redesign AV coat, they did not replace the heat shield on the Artemis II capsule with a new material. What they did instead was change the trajectory. The Artemis II re-entry profile was modified from a skip re-entry to what engineers call a loft re-entry, an initial dip into the upper atmosphere followed by a shorter duration climb back out, designed to maintain continuous heating throughout the descent. The idea is counterintuitive and genuinely brilliant in a way that should make you a little uneasy at the same time. By keeping the heating rate higher and more consistent, the outer char layer stays hot enough to remain permeable, the gases can vent, the pressure does not build, the cracking does not occur. Read that again. NASA's solution to a heat shield that cracked under too much heat during one phase of re-entry was to expose the crew to more heat. Not less. More. They did not fix the material. They changed how they flew through the atmosphere around it. They changed the angle, the duration, the thermal profile of the entire descent. Not because the new trajectory was inherently safer, but because it created heating conditions that happened to keep a flawed material from failing. An independent review team signed off on the approach. NASA expressed confidence. The crew expressed confidence. And on April 10th, 2026, the modified trajectory was flown for the first time with human beings aboard, and those human beings survived. The capsule splashed down. The parachutes deployed. The bullseye was hit. And somewhere in a NASA conference room, someone almost certainly breathed out a breath they had been holding for 2 years. But as I record this, the Orion capsule is being transported from the recovery ship to a facility where engineers will conduct the most closely watched post-flight inspection in the history of the Artemis program. They are going to examine every square inch of that Avcoat heat shield. They are going to look for cracking, for char loss, for spalling, for any evidence that the modified trajectory did not work as well as the models predicted. And what they find will determine whether this approach is used for every future Artemis mission. Missions that will carry humans to the lunar surface and back. Missions with even more aggressive re-entry profiles. Missions where the margin for error is even thinner than it was this time. If the shield looks clean, the engineering gamble paid off. If it does not, if there is significant char loss even on the modified trajectory, then the entire heat shield question reopens, and the timeline for every future Artemis mission stretches further into the future. That inspection is happening right now. The results have not been released. And the fact that a $4 billion crewed spacecraft just re-entered Earth's atmosphere at 32 times the speed of sound on a trajectory specifically designed to work around a material flaw that was discovered 3 years ago, and that we are still waiting to find out whether the workaround actually worked, tells you something about the gap between the press conference and the engineering reality. The celebration happened. The inspection is still ongoing. Those two things should not sit comfortably together, and the fact that they do is itself part of the pattern we're going to talk about tonight. But first, before we get to that pattern, before we talk about Challenger and Columbia, and a concept called normalization of deviance, there is something else that happened during those 10 days in space that deserves attention, because the heat shield was not the only thing that did not work as planned. Part 3, a cascade of small failures. There is a toilet on the Orion spacecraft that cost approximately $30 million to develop. It is an engineering achievement in its own right, a zero-gravity waste management system designed to function in the unique environment of deep space, where everything floats, where liquids behave in ways that would horrify anyone who has ever used a bathroom on Earth, and where the consequences of a failure range from deeply unpleasant to genuinely hazardous. $30 million is a lot of money for a toilet. But when you consider that the alternative is a crew of 4 people spending 10 days in a capsule smaller than a minivan with no functioning waste management, you begin to understand why NASA spent it. The toilet broke on day 1. Shortly after launch, the waste management system malfunctioned, and the crew had to work with Mission Control in Houston to troubleshoot the problem. One of the astronauts, the reports are a bit coy about which one, took on the informal role of what NASA's own blog post described as space plumber. The system was eventually restored to what NASA called go-for-use status, but the agency confirmed after splashdown that the toilet will require a full redesign for future missions. A $30 million system on its first crewed flight failed on day 1 and required a manual fix. That was not the only anomaly. Shortly after launch, the crew experienced a loss of communications with Mission Control. For a period that has not been precisely disclosed, NASA was unable to receive telemetry data from the spacecraft, and the crew's voice transmissions were not getting through to Houston. The failure was asymmetric in a way that made it particularly unsettling. The astronauts could hear Mission Control, but Mission Control could not hear them. They were listening to instructions from a ground team that had no idea whether those instructions were being received, followed, or even heard. For a brief window, the most advanced crewed spacecraft ever built was flying toward the moon with a one-way phone line. Commander Reed Wiseman also reported that his Microsoft Outlook email accounts were not functioning on the onboard computers. This sounds almost comically mundane compared to a heat shield with 100 cracks and a broken toilet, but it actually points to something important. The Orion spacecraft was designed and built over a period of more than 15 years. The software systems aboard it, including the IT infrastructure that the crew uses for communication and scheduling, were specified years ago and integrated into a hardware environment that does not get the kind of regular updates your laptop does. When your Outlook crashes at work, you restart it. When Outlook crashes on a spacecraft 200,000 miles from Earth, NASA has to gain remote access to the onboard computers to fix it. And then there was the service module. The European service module, built by the European Space Agency, is the propulsion and life support backbone of the Orion spacecraft. It provides thrust for trajectory corrections, powers the spacecraft's systems, and is responsible for critical functions including attitude control and thermal management. After splashdown, NASA mission managers confirmed that the service module will require a valve redesign based on in-flight performance data. The details are limited. NASA has not specified which valve, what the anomaly was, or how close it came to affecting the mission. But the fact that a redesign is required tells you that something operated outside expected parameters in a system responsible for keeping the crew alive. Now, I want to be fair here. Test flights have anomalies. That is the entire point of a test flight, to find the things that do not work in the controlled environment of a real mission so that you can fix them before the next one. Every Apollo mission had problems, Gemini missions had problems, the Space Shuttle's first flights had problems. Finding issues on Artemis II is not evidence of failure, it is evidence that the test worked. There is something I want to add here that I think is important for context. The Artemis II mission flew with what engineers call a free return trajectory. This means that even if every propulsion system on the spacecraft had failed completely, if the service module had gone dead, if the crew had lost all ability to fire engines, the capsule's trajectory was designed so that the moon's gravity would swing it around and send it back toward Earth automatically. No engine burn required, just orbital mechanics doing what orbital mechanics does. This is a safety feature borrowed from the Apollo program. Apollo 13 used a free return trajectory after its service module was crippled by an oxygen tank explosion in 1970, and that trajectory, combined with the lunar module acting as a lifeboat, is the reason the crew survived. Free return is elegant, passive, and reliable. It means that the worst-case scenario for Artemis II was always the crew comes home, even if multiple systems failed simultaneously. But free return trajectories have a limitation that matters for the point we're building toward tonight. They only work for missions that are going around the moon and coming straight back. They do not work for missions that are going to lunar orbit and staying there. They do not work for missions that are landing on the surface. They do not work for missions to Mars. Every future Artemis mission after Artemis II, every mission that actually accomplishes the goals of the program, will operate without a free return trajectory. The crews will be committed. They will be in lunar orbit or on the lunar surface, and their return to Earth will depend entirely on the continued functioning of their propulsion systems, their life support systems, their heat shield, their communications, and everything else that showed cracks, literally and figuratively, on this 10-day test flight. The anomalies on Artemis II were manageable because the mission architecture was forgiving. The next missions will not be. But there is a difference between isolated anomalies and a pattern, and what happened on Artemis II looks more like a pattern. A $30 million waste management system that failed on day one. A communication system that went asymmetric after launch. Software that crashed. A propulsion module valve that needs a redesign. And underneath all of it, a heat shield that was never actually fixed but was instead worked around with a modified trajectory that we will not know succeeded until the post-flight inspection is complete. Each of these problems individually is manageable. Each of them was managed. The toilet was fixed. The comms were restored. The outlook was debugged. The valve did not cause a mission failure. The crew came home. But when you step back and look at them together, when you see a spacecraft exhibiting this density of anomalies on a 10-day mission, with a 4-person crew and a free return trajectory that brought them home regardless, you have to ask a question that the celebration does not invite you to ask. If this is the failure rate for 10 days, what is the failure rate for 30 days? For 90 days? For the 900 days of a round trip to Mars, where there is no free return trajectory, where mission control is 20 minutes away by radio, where you cannot splash down in the Pacific if things go wrong because the Pacific is roughly 55 million miles behind you? That question is the gap. The distance between a 10-day test flight with manageable anomalies and a multi-year expedition where every one of those anomalies becomes a potential catastrophe. And the answer to that question depends on a kind of math that NASA does very well, but does not always like to talk about publicly. The math of compound probability, where the chances of something going wrong do not add up linearly with mission duration, but multiply. Where a 99% reliable system over 10 days becomes a 74% reliable system over 30 days, and a 36% reliable system over 100 days, and a 3% reliable system over a year. The systems on Orion are far more reliable than 99%. But the principle holds. The longer you fly, the more failures you accumulate. And what Artemis II just showed us is what the baseline failure rate actually looks like for this particular spacecraft on its first crewed flight. It is not zero. It is not close to zero. It is a spacecraft operating at the absolute edge of human engineering capability, where $30 million toilets break and email does not work, and valves behave in ways that require a redesign. The crew came home safely from all of it, but the crew was only gone for 10 days, and the readiness gap, the distance between where we are and where we need to be, just got a measurement. It was measured in broken toilets and one-way phone lines and valves that did not quite work, and it was measured in something else too, something invisible, something the crew carried home in their bodies without knowing it. Part 4, 12 millisieverts. There is a number that almost nobody talked about during the celebration. 12 millisieverts. That is the preliminary radiation dose that each of the 4 Artemis II crew members absorbed during their 10-day journey around the moon. It came from data transmitted by the instruments aboard Orion. 6 hybrid electronic radiation assessors positioned throughout the spacecraft, personal dosimeters manufactured by Mirion Technologies and worn by each astronaut, and an updated set of M42EXT detectors provided by the German Aerospace Center with significantly better energy resolution than the instruments flown on the uncrewed Artemis I mission. 12 millisieverts in 10 days. To put that in context, the average American absorbs about 3 millisieverts per year from natural background radiation. A chest X-ray gives you about 0.02 millisieverts. A CT scan of your chest is about 7 millisieverts. So in 10 days, the Artemis II crew each absorbed roughly the equivalent of 2 chest CT scans, or 4 years of natural background exposure, or 600 chest X-rays. And here is the part that matters, that 12 millisieverts is within NASA's career safety limits. It is not a crisis number. It is not a red flag in the formal sense. The crew is healthy. The dosimeters did their job. The radiation environment was monitored around the clock by teams at NASA and NOAA, watching the sun for any sign of a coronal mass ejection or solar particle event that could have dramatically increased the dose. None occurred. The mission was, from a radiation safety standpoint, a success. But here is what makes 12 millisieverts interesting. And by interesting, I mean genuinely concerning in a way that does not show up in the headlines. That number is approximately 18% higher than NASA's pre-flight models predicted. Not a rounding error, not a calibration artifact. 18%. Nearly a fifth higher than every model, every simulation, every calculation that NASA's radiation environment team produced in the years leading up to this mission. Now, on a 10-day mission, 18% is the difference between 12 millisieverts and the 10.2 or so that the models predicted. A difference of less than 2 millisieverts. That is well within safety margins. That is not going to give anyone radiation sickness. That is not going to trigger an emergency protocol. It is, in the language of the engineers, acceptable. But take that same 18% and apply it to a longer mission. Apply it to the Artemis IV surface mission that NASA is targeting for 2028, where astronauts will spend days or weeks on the lunar surface exposed not just to galactic cosmic rays, but to solar particle events without the protection of Earth's magnetic field or a significant atmosphere. Apply it to the eventual Mars mission, if it ever happens, where a crew would spend roughly 270 days in transit each way, with a surface stay of more than a year. The total mission duration for a round trip to Mars is approximately 900 days, 2.5 years. On a 900-day Mars mission, an 18% radiation modelling error is not the difference between 12 and 10. It is the difference between staying within NASA's 600 millisievert career dose limit and exceeding it. It is the difference between an acceptable lifetime cancer risk increase and an unacceptable one. It could be the difference between a crew that comes home and lives long, healthy lives and a crew that develops cardiovascular disease, cognitive decline, or radiation-induced cancer in their 40s or 50s. And that brings us to something that I think is one of the most important and most underreported scientific findings of the last decade. Because we do not have to guess about what happens to human beings who travel beyond Earth's magnetic shield and absorb deep space radiation. We have data. It is 50 years old, and it comes from the only other people who have ever done what the Artemis II crew just did. You need to understand something about the space between Earth and the Moon. It is not the same as low Earth orbit. The International Space Station orbits at about 250 miles above Earth's surface, comfortably inside the Van Allen radiation belts, 2 donut-shaped regions of charged particles trapped by Earth's magnetic field. Those belts are not perfect protection, but they block a significant portion of the highest energy particles that come from outside our solar system. Astronauts on the ISS still absorb radiation, but they absorb it at a rate and with a composition that is fundamentally different from what you encounter once you leave that magnetic cocoon. The Artemis II crew transited the Van Allen belts in less than an hour each way. That is a brief, intense exposure to trapped particles, protons and electrons spiraling along magnetic field lines, but it is short enough that the total dose from the belts themselves is relatively small. The real exposure comes from the remaining 9+ days spent in the space between the belts and the Moon, a region with no magnetic protection whatsoever, where the full flux of galactic cosmic radiation streams through the spacecraft and through the bodies of the crew, continuously, invisibly, and without any possibility of shielding. There is a poet's cruelty to galactic cosmic radiation. It has been travelling for millions of years, accelerated by events that happened before our species existed, and it arrives at a human body with enough energy to break the bonds that hold DNA together. Not all at once, not in a dramatic burst that triggers an alarm. One particle at a time, one strand at a time, one cell at a time. The crew sleeps, and the cosmic rays pass through them. The crew eats breakfast, and the cosmic rays pass through them. The crew conducts experiments, takes photographs of the lunar surface, troubleshoots a broken toilet, and the cosmic rays pass through them every second of every minute of every hour, leaving a trail of molecular damage so subtle that no instrument aboard the spacecraft can detect it in real time. The damage is measured afterward, in blood draws, in chromosome analysis, in the long statistical arc of a career spent tracking biomarkers that might, decades from now, tell us whether 10 days in deep space left a permanent mark on the bodies of 4 otherwise healthy people. This is the part of spaceflight that does not make for good television. There is no explosion. There is no dramatic music. There is just a number, 12 millisieverts, and a discrepancy, 18%, and a set of blood samples in a freezer somewhere waiting to be analysed. But I would argue that this quiet, invisible data is more important for the future of human spaceflight than the distance record, the splashdown accuracy, or any of the other numbers that made the news. Because the distance record tells us where we went. The radiation data tells us what it cost, and we are only beginning to understand the currency. Galactic cosmic rays are not like the radiation from a medical X-ray, or even a nuclear reactor. They are individual atoms, mostly hydrogen and helium nuclei, but also heavier elements like carbon, oxygen, silicon and iron, that have been stripped of their electrons and accelerated to nearly the speed of light by the shock waves of supernovae that exploded millions of years ago in distant parts of the galaxy. Some of these particles have been travelling through interstellar space for longer than human civilization has existed. They arrive at Earth from every direction, at energies that make them essentially impossible to stop with any practical thickness of shielding material. They pass through the walls of a spacecraft, through equipment, through bone, through tissue, through DNA. A single heavy ion cosmic ray, an iron nucleus travelling at 90% of the speed of light, can damage a chain of cells as it passes through a human body, snapping DNA strands and triggering mutations in a track of destruction thinner than a human hair. The crew cannot feel this happening. They cannot see it. They cannot hear it. They can only measure it after the fact by counting the damage, and that is exactly what NASA will be doing in the coming months. Analysing the blood samples taken aboard Orion during the mission, looking for chromosomal changes in white blood cells, for biomarkers of radiation damage that might tell them something about the biological cost of 10 days in deep space during the most active solar maximum in 20 years. Because Artemis II launched during solar cycle 25, which peaked around October of 2024, with a smooth sunspot number of 161, one of the strongest solar maxima in recent decades. During solar maximum, the Sun's increased activity actually modulates galactic cosmic rays slightly, pushing some of them away from the inner solar system. So the chronic background GCR dose was marginally lower than it would be during solar minimum. But the trade-off is that the chance of a sudden acute solar particle event, a burst of protons from a solar flare or coronal mass ejection, is dramatically higher. During the same solar cycle, in May of 2024, Earth experienced a G5 geomagnetic storm, the most intense in 2 decades, powerful enough to produce aurora visible from the tropics and knock 40 Starlink satellites out of orbit. The Artemis II crew flew through that same solar environment. They were exposed to that same elevated risk. They carried dosimeters that measured the reality of that exposure, and the reality was 18% worse than the models. That gap, that 18%, is a data point, a single data point from a single mission. But it is the first new data point we have gotten from beyond the Van Allen belts with modern instrumentation since the Apollo program ended in 1972. And what it suggests, quietly, without fanfare, in the fine print of a post-flight briefing, is that our understanding of the deep space radiation environment is not as complete as we thought it was. And to understand why that matters, why 12 millisieverts and an 18% overshoot should concern you even though the crew is fine and the mission was a success, we need to talk about what happened to the Apollo astronauts, not during their missions, after, decades after, in their hearts and their arteries and their cardiovascular systems, in ways that nobody expected and that took 50 years to become visible. Part 5. The Apollo Warning. In 2016, a researcher named Michael Delp at Florida State University published a study in the journal Scientific Reports that should have been front-page news and, for reasons we will get to, mostly was not. The study was simple in design and devastating in its findings. Delp and his colleagues looked at every NASA astronaut who had ever flown in space and divided them into 3 groups. Group 1, astronauts who were selected for the program but never flew an orbital mission. Group 2, astronauts who flew missions only in low Earth orbit, shuttle missions, ISS expeditions, Gemini, early Apollo tests. Group 3, the Apollo lunar astronauts, 24 men, the only human beings in history before April 1st of 2026 to have left Earth's magnetosphere and travelled through deep space. Delp's team tracked the mortality data for all 3 groups, paying particular attention to the cause of death. And when they sorted the numbers by cardiovascular disease, heart attacks, strokes, atherosclerosis, the full spectrum of conditions that kill more Americans than anything else, the results were stark. Non-flight astronauts, 9% cardiovascular disease mortality. Low Earth orbit astronauts, 11%. There was no statistically significant difference between those 2 groups. Flying in space, apparently, at least in the protected environment of low Earth orbit, did not meaningfully increase your risk of dying from heart disease compared to staying on the ground. Which makes sense in a way. These are extraordinarily healthy people. They are selected partly because their cardiovascular systems are in exceptional condition. They exercise rigorously. They are monitored constantly. If anything, you might expect astronauts to have lower rates of heart disease than the general population, and indeed they do. Apollo lunar astronauts, 43% cardiovascular disease mortality, 4 to 5 times higher than either of the other groups. Not double, not slightly elevated, 4 to 5 times. Let me say that again, because I think it is one of the most important numbers in the history of human spaceflight, and almost nobody knows it. The only human beings who had ever travelled beyond Earth's magnetic shield, through the Van Allen belts, into deep space to the moon and back, died of cardiovascular disease at a rate 4 to 5 times higher than astronauts who stayed in low Earth orbit. Same selection criteria, same physical fitness standards, same demographic profile, same era of medicine and healthcare. The only variable that differed between the 2 groups was exposure to deep space radiation. Delp did not stop at the epidemiological data. He wanted to know whether the correlation had a mechanism, so his team designed an animal study. They exposed mice to iron-ion radiation, heavy ion particles that simulate the galactic cosmic rays encountered beyond Earth's magnetosphere, and observed the effects on their vascular systems over time. After 6 months, which is roughly equivalent to 20 human years, the irradiated mice showed significant impairment of arterial function. Specifically, they exhibited damage to the vascular endothelium, the thin layer of cells that lines the interior of every blood vessel in the body. Endothelial dysfunction is the first step in a well-documented cascade that leads to atherosclerosis, which is the hardening and narrowing of arteries, which is the primary cause of heart attacks and strokes. The proposed pathway is disturbingly elegant. Galactic cosmic radiation, the same radiation that passes through a spacecraft and its crew continuously during a deep space mission, damages the endothelial cells of blood vessels at the molecular level. The damage is subtle enough that it does not cause immediate symptoms. The astronaut feels fine. The dosimeter reads within limits. The mission continues. But over decades, the accumulated endothelial damage progresses into full-blown cardiovascular disease at a rate that massively exceeds what you would expect from age, genetics, or lifestyle alone. I want you to imagine something. Imagine you are one of the 12 Apollo astronauts who walked on the moon between 1969 and 1972. You're in your late 20s or 30s. You're in the best physical condition of your life. You've been selected from thousands of applicants for your health, your fitness, your intelligence, your ability to perform under pressure. You fly to the moon. You walk on its surface. You come home to a ticker-tape parade. You live the rest of your life as one of the most famous human beings who ever existed. And then, in your 60s or 70s, you start having heart problems. Your arteries are hardening faster than your doctors expected. Your cardiovascular system, which was exceptional when you were selected for the program, is deteriorating in ways that do not match your age, your genetics, or your lifestyle. You might not connect it to the moon. Why would you? The mission was decades ago. You feel fine. Everyone your age has health problems. But then Michael Delp publishes his study, and suddenly there is a number, 43%, that hangs over the Apollo lunar cohort like a question that cannot quite be answered. Were you damaged by the mission that made you famous? Is the thing that defined your life also the thing that is shortening it? And if so, what does that mean for the people who are about to follow in your footsteps? The Artemis II crew cannot answer that question today. They are healthy, they feel fine, their dosimeters are within limits. But the Apollo data suggests that the answer may not arrive for 20, 30 or 40 years. It suggests that the biological cost of deep space radiation operates on a timescale that is fundamentally incompatible with the way we evaluate mission safety. We assess risk before the mission. We celebrate success after the mission. But the damage, if the Delp data is real, does not manifest until long after both the assessment and the celebration are distant memories. And that is a readiness gap of a different kind. Not a gap in engineering or institutional behaviour, but a gap in time. A gap between exposure and consequence. A gap that means we might be sending people into an environment that is damaging them in ways we will not be able to confirm until it is far, far too late to change course. Now, I need to be honest with you about the limitations of this study, because that is what we do on this channel. The Apollo sample size is extremely small, 24 total lunar astronauts. At the time of Delp's study, only 7 of them had died from cardiovascular disease. 7 deaths is a small number to draw sweeping conclusions from, and some researchers have questioned whether the 43% figure is statistically robust given the sample size. A 2018 follow-up study by Elgart and colleagues, also published in Scientific Reports, looked at a broader cohort of astronauts and found elevated cardiovascular risk, but less dramatic numbers than Delp reported. The question is genuinely open. It has not been settled. And that, frankly, is part of what makes it so concerning. Because the reason it has not been settled is that the sample size has been too small. Only 24 human beings have ever been beyond Earth's magnetosphere. That is not enough people to run the kind of large-scale epidemiological study that would give you a definitive answer. You would need hundreds, ideally thousands, of deep space travelers to resolve the statistical uncertainty. And that is exactly what the Artemis program is beginning to provide. The Artemis II crew, Wiseman, Glover, Koch and Hansen, just became the 25th through 28th human beings to travel beyond Earth's magnetosphere. They absorbed approximately 12 millisieverts of radiation over 10 days, 18% more than predicted, during one of the most active solar maxima in 2 decades. Blood samples were taken aboard Orion and will be analysed for chromosomal damage, DNA breakage, and other biomarkers of radiation injury. The results will take months to process. The long-term cardiovascular effects, if the Delp findings are correct, will take decades to manifest. In the meantime, we are in a strange position. We have enough data to be worried, but not enough to be certain. We have a 43% number from a small sample that might be a statistical fluke or might be the most important warning sign in the history of human spaceflight. We have 18% radiation overshoots from the first modern deep space dosimetry, and we have a program that is planning to send more and more people beyond the Van Allen belts, to the Moon, eventually to Mars, on missions that are longer, with higher cumulative exposures, into a radiation environment that we just learned we understand about 18% less well than we thought we did. The readiness gap is not just in the hardware. It is not just in the heat shields and the toilets and the valves. It is in our bodies, in the soft tissue of our blood vessels, in the DNA of our cells, in the biological machinery that evolved over millions of years under the protection of a magnetic field and an atmosphere that we are only now beginning to leave behind. And the most unsettling part is not the damage itself, it is the timeline. The Apollo astronauts flew in the late 1960s and early 1970s. The cardiovascular mortality data did not become visible until 4 or 5 decades later. If Artemis II's radiation exposure is causing the same kind of endothelial damage, we will not know for certain until the 2060s or 2070s. By then, dozens or hundreds more people may have flown the same missions. That is the biological dimension of the readiness gap. The engineering dimension is the heat shield and the broken toilet and the valve redesign. But there is a third dimension, one that might be the most important of all. It is not about hardware or biology. It is about institutions, about organizations, about the way that human beings working in groups make decisions about risk, and it has a name. Part 6. Normalization of Deviance. In 1996, a sociologist named Diane Vaughan published a book called The Challenger Launch Decision. It was about the Space Shuttle Challenger, which broke apart 73 seconds after launch on January 28, 1986, killing all 7 crew members, including Krista McAuliffe, who would have been the first teacher in space. The disaster was caused by the failure of an O-ring seal in the right solid rocket booster. Cold temperatures on the morning of the launch had stiffened the rubber O-ring, preventing it from sealing properly. Hot propellant gas leaked through the joint, burned through the external tank, and the shuttle was destroyed in a fireball witnessed by millions of people, including McAuliffe's students watching from the bleachers at Kennedy Space Center. That is the version of the story most people know. The O-ring failed. NASA should not have launched in cold weather. It was a preventable accident caused by a specific technical failure under specific environmental conditions. Fix the O-ring. Do not launch when it's cold. Problem solved. Vaughan spent years researching Challenger, and what she found was something much more disturbing than a single failed O-ring. She found a pattern, a process, a way that large, sophisticated, technically excellent organizations gradually drift from safety into catastrophe without anyone noticing, without anyone intending it, and without any single person making a decision that they would recognize as reckless. She called it the normalization of deviance. And the concept is simple enough to describe in a single paragraph, but the implications are vast enough to fill a book. Here is the basic idea. An organization designs a system with certain specifications. The system is supposed to work in a particular way. On the first mission, something deviates from the specification, not catastrophically, but measurably. The deviation is noted. Engineers discuss it. Management evaluates the risk. And because the mission succeeded, because no one died, because the system functioned well enough, the deviation is accepted. It becomes part of the new baseline. On the next mission, the same deviation occurs. This time, it is expected. It is no longer an anomaly. It is just how the system works. Over time, through repetition and survival, what was originally a deviation from design becomes normal. What was originally a risk becomes an accepted feature. What was originally a warning sign becomes background noise. And then, one day, the deviation that was always there, the one everyone knew about, the one that had been discussed in meetings and documented in reports and flagged by engineers and accepted by managers, crosses a threshold that nobody saw coming. The margin that everyone assumed existed turns out to have been thinner than they thought, and people die. With Challenger, the deviation was O-ring erosion. NASA knew about it. It was not a secret. It was not hidden. Engineers at Morton Thiokol, the company that manufactured the solid rocket boosters, had documented O-ring erosion on flight after flight. They had raised concerns. They had written memos. They had argued, in some cases passionately, that the erosion pattern was dangerous and that the boosters should be redesigned. But the shuttles kept flying. 24 missions launched with known O-ring erosion before Challenger. 24 times the O-rings eroded and the shuttle survived. Each survival reinforced the belief that the erosion was within acceptable limits. Each safe return made the next launch slightly easier to approve. The risk was normalized. The deviance became the standard. On January 28, 1986, the 25th shuttle launch with known O-ring erosion encountered temperatures that pushed the erosion past the invisible line. 73 seconds, 7 people, a nation watching. Vaughan's work on Challenger was groundbreaking. It shifted the blame from individual bad actors to systemic organizational behavior. It was not that NASA managers were reckless or incompetent. It was that they were embedded in a system that rewarded continued flight, that penalized delays, that processed risk through a framework of incremental acceptance, that made each individual decision seem reasonable even as the cumulative trajectory pointed toward disaster. And then it happened again. On February 1st, 2003, the Space Shuttle Columbia broke apart during re-entry over Texas and Louisiana. The cause was a piece of foam insulation from the external tank that had struck the leading edge of Columbia's left wing during launch. The impact damaged the reinforced carbon-carbon thermal protection panels on the wing. When Columbia re-entered the atmosphere 16 days later, superheated plasma entered the wing structure through the breach, and the orbiter was destroyed. 7 more people died. 7 more families got the worst phone call imaginable. I want to tell you about the morning of January 28, 1986, because the details matter. The temperature at Kennedy Space Center in Florida was 36 degrees Fahrenheit, unusually cold for central Florida, cold enough that icicles had formed on the launch pad overnight. Engineers at Morton Thiokol, the company that manufactured the solid rocket boosters, had spent the previous evening in a teleconference with NASA arguing against the launch. They had data showing that the O-ring seals in the booster joints lost their flexibility in cold temperatures. They had a chart. They had test results. They had the voice of Roger Boisjoli, a senior engineer at Thiokol, who would later testify that he had felt physically ill watching the launch because he believed the O-rings would fail. NASA pushed back. The agency was under schedule pressure. There had already been multiple launch delays. The Teacher in Space project, Krista McAuliffe's presence on the crew, had generated enormous public interest, and every delay was covered by the media. The conversation that night went back and forth, with Thiokol engineers arguing against launch and NASA managers asking Thiokol to prove that it was unsafe, rather than requiring NASA to prove that it was safe. That inversion, the burden of proof shifting from prove it is safe to fly to prove it is unsafe to fly, is one of the most important details in the entire Challenger story. It is the moment when normalization of deviance crossed from institutional habit into active, conscious risk acceptance. Thiokol management overruled their own engineers. The launch was approved. 73 seconds later, Roger Boisjoli's prediction came true. The O-ring failed. The joint leaked. Hot gas burned through the external tank. The shuttle broke apart at 48,000 feet. The crew cabin separated from the orbiter and fell for 2 minutes and 45 seconds before hitting the Atlantic Ocean at roughly 200 miles per hour. At least some of the crew members were conscious during the fall. Emergency air packs had been activated. They were alive, aware, and falling for nearly 3 minutes, and there was nothing anyone could do. I tell you those details not to be gratuitous, but because I think they matter when we talk about the decisions being made today about Artemis. The people who die when risk is normalized are not abstractions. They are not statistics. They are not acceptable losses in the calculus of exploration. They are people who trusted that the organizations responsible for their safety were making decisions based on evidence rather than momentum, and the organizations were making decisions based on evidence. The problem is that the evidence had been filtered through a process that turned warnings into noise. 17 years after Challenger, the same thing happened with Columbia. I want to walk through that one too, because the parallels to the Avicoat situation are more direct. During Columbia's launch on January 16, 2003, a briefcase-sized piece of foam insulation separated from the external tank and struck the leading edge of the left wing at roughly 500 miles per hour. The impact was captured on camera. Engineers on the ground saw it. They requested satellite imagery to assess the damage. That request was denied by management. An engineering team used a mathematical model called Crater to estimate the damage and concluded it was within acceptable limits. But Crater had never been validated for the size of foam that actually hit Columbia, and the team knew this and flagged it, and the flag was not acted upon. For 16 days, Columbia orbited the Earth with a hole in its wing that nobody on the ground had confirmed or denied. The crew was not informed. They went about their mission. They conducted experiments. They took photographs. They did not know that their heat shield had been compromised. On February 1st, during re-entry, superheated plasma entered the wing through the foam strike damage. The wing structure failed. Columbia broke apart over Texas at an altitude of roughly 200,000 feet, traveling at more than 12,000 miles per hour. The debris field stretched across 2 states. All 7 crew members were lost. The investigation that followed found that the foam strike was not a surprise. It was expected. It had been happening for decades. It was, in Vaughan's terminology, a deviation that had been normalized so thoroughly that the organization could no longer see it as a threat. The foam shedding was not new. It had been happening for years. Decades, in fact. Over 113 shuttle missions, foam had repeatedly separated from the external tank during launch. The damage it caused had been observed, documented, analysed and accepted. Engineers had flagged it. Reports had been written. Presentations had been given, and the shuttles kept flying. Because the foam had been shedding for 113 missions and nobody had died from it. The deviation had been normalised. The risk had been accepted. The background noise had become deafening, but nobody could hear it anymore. Diane Vaughan was asked to serve on the Columbia Accident Investigation Board. She reviewed the organisational dynamics that led to the disaster, and she found the same pattern she had documented 17 years earlier with Challenger. The same incremental acceptance, the same institutional drift from caution to confidence. The same process by which an organisation that knew it had a problem, that had documentation of the problem, analysis of the problem, warnings about the problem, gradually redefined the problem from anomaly to characteristic, to acceptable risk, to normal. And then, when the problem finally exceeded its invisible threshold, the same terrible surprise, the same shock that it could happen here, to us, in our program, with our people. Vaughan wrote that the pattern had a long incubation period, years, sometimes decades, punctuated by early warning signs that were either misinterpreted, ignored, or missed completely. The organisation was not lying to itself. It was not covering up danger. It was doing something far more insidious. It was processing danger through a framework that was designed to enable continued operations, and the framework was working exactly as designed. It was producing acceptable risk determinations because that was what it was built to produce. The problem was not a single bad decision. The problem was a system that made each individual decision appear sound, while the overall trajectory moved steadily toward catastrophe. I need you to hold that concept in your mind. Normalization of deviance, the long incubation period, the early warning signs that become background noise, because we are about to come back to the heat shield on the Orion spacecraft. And when we do, I want you to be able to see the pattern. But let me give you the Columbia story in a little more detail first, because the parallels are more specific than you might think. Columbia was destroyed by a failure of its thermal protection system. Challenger was destroyed by a failure of its propulsion seal. Those are different systems, different failure modes, different physics. But the organisational failure was identical. In both cases, the problem was known. In both cases, the problem had occurred on previous flights without causing a catastrophe. In both cases, the survival of previous flights was taken as evidence that the problem was within acceptable limits, and in both cases, the problem eventually exceeded those limits with no warning, no gradual escalation, no second chance. The through line is thermal protection. Challenger's O-rings were a thermal seal. They were supposed to prevent hot propellant gas from escaping through the booster joints. Columbia's reinforced carbon-carbon panels were thermal protection. They were supposed to prevent the heat of re-entry from reaching the wing structure. Both failures were about the boundary between survivable temperatures and lethal ones. Both failures occurred in systems where known deviations had been normalized over multiple flights. And now I want you to think about AV coat, the ablative heat shield on the Orion spacecraft, the thermal protection system that cracked and spooled in more than 100 locations on Artemis I, the material that was not replaced for Artemis II, the system that was instead worked around by changing the re-entry trajectory, the fix that NASA's independent review board approved, the trajectory that was flown on April 10, 2026, and that the crew survived. Challenger's O-ring survived 24 flights before the 25th one killed 7 people. Columbia's foam survived 113 missions before the 114th one killed 7 more. Artemis II's AV coat, the AV coat that cracked on Artemis I and was worked around rather than fixed, has survived 1 crewed flight. 1. Part 7. The third chapter. I am not saying that the Artemis II heat shield is going to fail on the next flight. I am not saying that NASA is making the same mistake it made with Challenger or Columbia. I am not a thermal protection engineer, and I do not have access to the ArcJet test data or the independent review board's full analysis. What I am saying is that the pattern, the structural pattern, the organizational pattern, the one that Diane Vaughan spent her career documenting, fits. And when a pattern like that fits, the burden should be on the organization to prove that this time is different, not on the rest of us to assume it. Here is what we know. Artemis I revealed a significant, unexpected anomaly in the Avicoat heat shield. More than 100 locations of char loss, where the material cracked and broke away rather than ablating smoothly. NASA's own Office of Inspector General report identified 3 potential crew kill mechanisms from the spalling, including the possibility that heat could reach and melt structural bolts holding the heat shield assembly together. An independent analysis published in March of 2026 titled "Artemis II is not safe to fly" argued that the actual crew loss probability for the mission ranged from 1 in 2 to 1 in 50, far higher than NASA's stated acceptable threshold of 1 in 30. NASA's response to the AV coat problem was not to redesign the material. It was not to develop a new heat shield. It was to modify the re-entry trajectory so that the heating profile would keep the material permeable throughout descent, preventing the gas trapping that caused the cracking. This is clever engineering. It is creative problem solving. It may well be correct. But it is also, in Vaughan's terminology, a deviation that has now been accepted as the new baseline. The original specification for AV coat was that it would work on any re-entry trajectory within the design envelope. It did not. The specification was narrowed. A workaround was implemented. The system was declared acceptable. The mission flew, and it succeeded. That is the part that makes normalization of deviance so dangerous. The success. The crew survived. The heat shield did not fail. The modified trajectory appears to have worked. And every person in the chain of command who approved the decision to fly with the AV coat workaround, rather than a redesigned heat shield now, has data suggesting they were right. That data will make the next decision easier. It will make the next deviation from the original specification slightly more acceptable. It will make the next workaround slightly less alarming. Let me put it this way, because I think the analogy is precise enough to be useful. Imagine you own a car, and one day you notice that the brake pads are worn unevenly. A mechanic tells you the pads are not failing, but they are wearing in a pattern that was not intended by the manufacturer. The mechanic recommends replacing the brake pads with a new set designed to wear evenly. Instead, you decide to change how you drive. You brake earlier, more gradually at lower speeds, in a way that keeps the uneven wear pattern from causing a problem. You do this for a year. The brakes work fine. You never have an incident. You tell your friends the brakes are good. And because the brakes have worked fine for a year, you gradually stop braking earlier and more gradually. You start driving the way you used to, because the brakes have been fine, and changing how you drive is inconvenient and life is busy, and it has been a year without a problem. That is normalization of deviance applied to your morning commute. Now scale it up to a spacecraft re-entering Earth's atmosphere at Mach 32 with 4 people inside, and you understand why Diane Vaughan's concept keeps me up at night when I think about the Artemis program. There is another element of this pattern that is worth naming explicitly, because it applies directly to where NASA is right now. Vaughan identified that normalization is accelerated by external pressure, schedule pressure, budget pressure, political pressure, competition. The O-ring concerns at Thiokol were overridden partly because of launch schedule pressure. The foam concerns on Columbia were not fully investigated partly because of the operational tempo of the shuttle program. These are not excuses. They are environmental factors that make normalization more likely and faster. The Artemis program, as we sit here in April of 2026, is operating under extraordinary external pressure. Congressional scrutiny of the program's cost, roughly $4.1 billion per SLS plus Orion launch, is intense and growing. The geopolitical competition with China is real and accelerating. The Starship HLS delays are compressing the timeline. The public expectation, set by NASA's own messaging about the path to the surface being open, creates its own momentum. Every one of these pressures pushes in the same direction. Fly. Move forward. Keep the timeline. Do not slow down. And the heat shield decision, the decision to fly the AV coat workaround rather than redesign the material, was made within this pressure environment. I am not saying the pressure caused the decision. I am saying that Vaughan's research demonstrates with historical rigor that this kind of pressure accelerates the normalization of exactly this kind of deviation. And the fact that the mission succeeded will, by the logic of the pattern, make the deviation feel more acceptable for the next mission, and the next, and the next, until either someone breaks the cycle or the cycle breaks them. That is not a prediction of doom. It is a description of a process that has been documented in 2 separate shuttle disasters, that has been studied by one of the most respected sociologists of technology in the world, and that has been identified by every major accident investigation board in the history of NASA. The question is not whether the process exists. It does. The question is whether NASA has broken the cycle this time, or whether the cycle is simply reset. We will not know the answer for years, possibly decades. We will not know until AVCOAT has been flown on 5 missions or 10 or 20. Until it has been flown in conditions slightly outside the modified envelope, in solar weather slightly worse than expected, on trajectories slightly more aggressive than the one Artemis II used. Until the accumulation of successful flights has either validated the workaround or, and this is the possibility that nobody at NASA wants to think about, until the accumulation of successful flights has normalized the deviation so thoroughly that the next anomaly comes as a complete surprise. Challenger's O-rings eroded for 8 years before the disaster. Columbia's foam shed for 22 years before the disaster. We're now in year 1 of AVCOAT's normalization window, and the readiness gap, the distance between our confidence and our actual safety margin, is at its widest right now, in this moment, when the celebration of a successful mission is loudest, and the institutional pressure to move forward is strongest. That is the third dimension of the gap. Not hardware, not biology, institutions, the way we make decisions, the way we process risk, the way we tell ourselves stories about what success means. And right now, the story NASA is telling, the path to the surface is open, is a story built on a heat shield that was worked around rather than fixed, radiation data that exceeded predictions by 18%, a waste management system that failed on day 1, a communication system that went one way after launch, a service module valve that needs a redesign, and a set of future mission timelines that are, as we're about to discuss, in serious trouble. Because the next question, the one that follows naturally from everything we have discussed so far, is not, can we get to the moon? We just demonstrated that we can orbit it. The question is, can we land on it? And the answer to that question is much less encouraging than anything NASA said at the Splashdown press conference. Part 8. A surface that keeps retreating. There is a date that got quietly changed while everyone was watching Artemis II fly around the moon, and it is one of the most important dates in the Artemis program's timeline. On February 27th, 2026, about a month before Artemis II launched, NASA Administrator Jared Isaacman confirmed a revised plan for the next missions in the program. The revision was significant. Artemis III, which had originally been planned as the mission that would return American astronauts to the lunar surface for the first time since 1972, was downgraded. It would no longer attempt a landing. Instead, Artemis III, targeted for mid-2027, would be an orbital test of one or both of the commercially developed human landing system vehicles, SpaceX's Starship HLS and Blue Origin's Blue Moon, in Earth orbit. Not lunar orbit, Earth orbit. No landing, no surface operations, just a rendezvous and docking test. The actual crewed lunar landing was pushed to Artemis IV, now targeted for early 2028. If that date holds, and the people whose job it is to evaluate these timelines are expressing serious doubt that it will, Artemis IV will be the first American crewed lunar landing since Apollo 17 in December of 1972. 56 years between boots on the moon, more than half a century. The reason Artemis III was downgraded has a name, and that name is Starship. SpaceX's Starship human landing system is the vehicle that NASA is counting on to carry astronauts from lunar orbit down to the surface and back up again. It is, by any measure, the most ambitious rocket ever designed. It is nearly 400 feet tall. It is designed to be fully reusable. It uses a propulsion system that requires in-orbit refueling, multiple Starship tanker flights launching from Earth, rendezvousing in orbit, transferring cryogenic propellant from one vehicle to another in microgravity, a process that has never been demonstrated at this scale. And as of March of 2026, Starship HLS had not completed its ship-to-ship propellant transfer demonstration. It had not completed its design certification review. NASA officials acknowledged publicly that SpaceX was behind on HLS development. The Aerospace Safety Advisory Panel, NASA's independent oversight body, published a report stating that programmatic and technical risks with these systems have continued to emerge and affect the overall Artemis III schedule and risk management, and expressed what they carefully described as serious doubt about whether the timeline was obtainable. Let me give you a sense of the scale of the Starship HLS challenge, because I think it gets lost in the headlines about launch dates and mission numbers. To land a crew on the moon using the Artemis architecture, the following things have to happen in sequence, flawlessly. First, a Starship HLS vehicle has to be launched into Earth orbit. Then, between 10 and 16 additional Starship tanker flights have to launch, rendezvous with the HLS vehicle in orbit, and transfer cryogenic propellant, liquid oxygen and liquid methane, from one vehicle to another in microgravity. This orbital refueling process has never been demonstrated at this scale with these propellants. Each transfer requires precise alignment, docking, and fluid management in zero gravity, where liquids behave in ways that are fundamentally different from anything on Earth. Once the HLS is fully fueled, carrying enough propellant for a journey to the moon, a descent to the surface, an ascent back to orbit, and a rendezvous with Orion, it fires its engines and heads for the moon. It enters lunar orbit. It waits for the Orion spacecraft, which has been launched separately on SLS with the crew aboard. Orion and HLS dock in lunar orbit. 2 crew members transfer from Orion to the lander. The lander undocks, descends to the lunar surface, conducts surface operations, ascends back to orbit, redocks with Orion, the crew transfers back, and Orion heads home. Every single one of those steps has to work. The orbital refueling, the translunar injection, the lunar orbit insertion, the docking in lunar orbit, the descent, the landing, the surface EVAs, the ascent, the redocking, the crew transfer, the return. Any failure at any point could strand the crew in lunar orbit, on the surface, or somewhere in between with limited options for rescue. And the vehicle that is supposed to accomplish all of this, the Starship HLS, had not completed its propellant transfer demonstration as of March 2026. It had not passed its design certification review. Its development timeline has slipped repeatedly. The company building it, SpaceX, has had multiple Starship test flights end in explosions, which is, to be fair, part of their iterative design philosophy. They learn from each failure, they iterate quickly. They are extraordinarily good at what they do, but extraordinarily good at iterating through explosions is a different thing from ready to carry humans to the lunar surface by 2028. This is the paradox at the center of the Artemis program. The most capable vehicle in the architecture is also the least ready. And the schedule pressure created by geopolitical competition, congressional expectations, and institutional momentum is pushing the program to commit to timelines that its own safety oversight does not believe are achievable. We have seen this dynamic before. We know where it leads when the pressure to fly outpaces the readiness to fly safely. Let me translate that from bureaucratic language into plain English. The vehicle that is supposed to land humans on the moon has not passed its most basic tests. The company building it is behind schedule. NASA's own safety watchdog does not believe the timeline is realistic, and the response was to push the landing to a later mission and hope that the extra time is enough. This is the Starship paradox, and it is one of the most fascinating tensions in the entire history of space exploration. SpaceX's Starship is genuinely revolutionary. If it works as designed, fully reusable, rapidly refuelable, capable of carrying over 100 tons to low Earth orbit, it changes everything. It makes the moon accessible. It makes Mars possible. It makes space infrastructure, lunar bases, orbital refueling depots, and deep space habitats economically viable in ways that nothing else in the current or planned inventory can match. But the vehicle that could enable everything is also the single largest source of schedule risk for the entire Artemis program. Starship's development philosophy, SpaceX's build it, fly it, blow it up, learn from it approach, is fundamentally incompatible with the timeline pressures of a government program that needs to certify a human-rated vehicle by a specific date. SpaceX iterates fast. They accept failures as data. They redesign between flights. That works brilliantly for developing a rocket. It works terribly for meeting a fixed deadline that Congress and international partners are watching. So here is where we stand after Artemis II. The mission that was supposed to prove we could orbit the moon succeeded. The mission that was supposed to land on the moon was downgraded to an orbital test because the lander is not ready. The mission that will now attempt the landing is targeted for a date that NASA's own safety panel does not believe is achievable. And underneath all of this, the same heat shield that we spent the first part of this video discussing, the one that was worked around rather than fixed, will need to protect crews on every single one of these missions. The same radiation environment that exceeded models by 18% will be waiting for every crew that leaves Earth's magnetosphere. The same biological unknowns that may have given Apollo astronauts 4 to 5 times elevated cardiovascular mortality will apply to every person who makes the trip. And here is the number that, more than any other, defines the gap between aspiration and reality for the Artemis program. SLS costs approximately $4.1 billion per launch. That includes the rocket, the Orion capsule, and ground operations. $4.1 billion. For comparison, SpaceX's Falcon 9 costs approximately $67 million per launch. Even if you adjust for payload capacity, SLS can deliver significantly more mass to orbit than a single Falcon 9. The cost disparity is staggering. It means that the cadence of Artemis missions is fundamentally limited by budget. At $4.1 billion per flight, NASA can afford approximately one SLS launch per year. That is not a technical limitation, it is a financial one. And it means that the pace of progress toward the lunar surface is not determined by how fast engineers can solve problems. It is determined by how often Congress is willing to write a $4 billion check. The readiness gap is not closing, it is compounding. Each new piece of the puzzle, the Starship delays, the heat shield workaround, the radiation overshoot, the system failures, adds another variable to an equation that gets more complex with every mission, and the timeline is not waiting. Because while NASA is working through these challenges at the pace of government procurement and congressional appropriation, there is another space program on the other side of the planet that is not waiting at all. Part 9. The Clocks. In August of 2026, 4 months from now as I record this, China is planning to launch Chang'e 7 to the lunar South Pole, not into orbit, to the surface. The mission will include an orbiter, a lander, a mini-hopping probe designed to explore permanently shadowed craters, and a rover. Its primary objective is to map resources near the South Pole and search for water ice in the same permanently shadowed regions that the Artemis program has identified as its primary scientific and strategic target. Chang'e 7 is not China's first rodeo at the moon. Chang'e 4 landed on the lunar far side in 2019, the first spacecraft ever to do so. Chang'e 5 returned lunar samples in 2020. Chang'e 6 in 2024 returned samples from the far side of the moon, another first. Each mission has been executed on schedule, within budget, and with a level of methodical precision that stands in quiet contrast to the Artemis program's timeline revisions. Chang'e 8 follows in 2028. It will test in situ resource utilization technologies, the ability to extract useful materials from lunar soil, a capability that is essential for any permanent human presence on the moon. Together, Chang'e 7 and Chang'e 8 will form what China calls the Lunar Research Station prototype, a robotic precursor to a permanent crewed base that China and Russia are jointly planning for the lunar South Pole, with a target date of 2035. I am not telling you this to make it a competition. The science does not care about flags, but the timeline matters because it creates pressure, and pressure interacts with the readiness gap in dangerous ways. If Artemis 4 slips past 2028, and the people whose job it is to evaluate this believe it might, then there is a real possibility that China will have operational robotic infrastructure at the South Pole before a single American astronaut sets foot on the lunar surface. That is not a failure of American engineering. It is a consequence of architectural choices, the decision to build SLS from shuttle hardware, the decision to rely on a lander that has not been demonstrated, that were made years ago for political and economic reasons that had little to do with the fastest or most efficient path to the moon. And there is another clock ticking. The International Space Station, humanity's only permanent foothold in space, continuously inhabited since November of the year 2000, is targeted for deorbit in January of 2031. The plan is to lower its orbit gradually and use a SpaceX-built deorbit vehicle to guide the 350-ton structure into a controlled re-entry over the South Pacific. There is something almost poetic about the contrast. On one side of the planet, the United States is celebrating a successful lunar flyby and debating when its lander will be ready. On the other side, China is preparing to put a rover on the South Pole in 4 months, followed by a resource utilization demonstrator 2 years after that, followed by a permanent robotic base within the next decade. No fanfare, no press conferences about the path to the surface being open, just a methodical step-by-step program executing on schedule. China's approach is fundamentally different from the Artemis architecture, where Artemis relies on the largest rocket ever flown, SLS, paired with the most ambitious lander ever designed, Starship. China is building incrementally. Small missions that prove specific technologies, robotic precursors that map resources before humans arrive, a philosophy that says let the robots go first, confirm the science, demonstrate the technology, and then send people. Neither approach is inherently superior, but one of them has been executing on schedule for the past 7 years, and the other has been revising its timeline for the past 3. And the gap between them, the gap between methodical robotic progress and ambitious human spaceflight promises, is widening, not narrowing. The ISS question makes this even more urgent. Humanity has maintained a continuous presence in orbit since November 2nd of the year 2000. 25 years and counting. That streak is not guaranteed to continue. The station is aging, coolant loops are leaking, structural modules are showing signs of fatigue. The planned deorbit in 2031 assumes that a replacement, a commercial space station capable of hosting research and crew, will be operational by then. But every independent assessment says it will not. The Office of Inspector General says early 2030s at best. That means a gap during which the species that just celebrated flying 4 people around the moon might not have anywhere to send people in orbit at all. The question that nobody has a good answer to is what replaces it. NASA has contracted with several companies to develop commercial space stations that would take over low Earth orbit operations. But NASA's own Office of Inspector General concluded that these commercial stations are unlikely to be operational before the early 2030s, which means there is a very real possibility of a gap, a window of time, possibly years, during which humanity has no permanent presence in orbit. ISS Program Manager Dana Weigel has acknowledged that NASA may need to extend the life of the ISS to avoid this gap. But extension has limits. The station's structure is aging. Its modules were designed for 15-year lifespans and have been in orbit for more than 25. Coolant leaks have been increasing. Structural integrity is a growing concern. So picture the situation. Artemis is celebrating a successful flyby, but cannot land until 2028 at the earliest, with serious doubt about even that date. China is preparing to send robots to the same part of the moon that Artemis is targeting. The only existing human outpost in space is scheduled to be destroyed in less than 5 years, with no confirmed replacement. And the vehicle that is supposed to make everything possible, Starship, has not completed its most basic demonstration flights. The readiness gap is not just about Artemis. It is about the entire architecture of humanity's presence in space. We are in a moment where everything is supposed to be transitioning, from ISS to commercial stations, from low Earth orbit to the lunar surface, from government monopoly to public-private partnership, and every single piece of that transition is behind schedule, over budget, or dependent on technology that has not been demonstrated. And if you want to understand what the readiness gap really means, what it means not in the abstract but in terms of human lives and human ambition, you only have to look one step further down the road. Past the moon, past the South Pole, past the water ice and the permanently shadowed craters, past the Artemis program entirely, to a destination that makes everything we have discussed tonight look like a warm-up exercise. I want to leave you with one more image before we move to the final part of tonight's video. Right now, at this moment, the International Space Station is passing overhead at 17,500 miles per hour, carrying a crew of people from multiple nations who are conducting experiments, maintaining systems, and living in space the way human beings have been living in space continuously for more than 25 years. That continuity, that unbroken thread of human presence beyond Earth, is something we take for granted. We assume it will continue. We assume that when ISS is gone, something will replace it. But assumptions are not architecture. Assumptions are not funding. Assumptions are not hardware in orbit. And the gap between the assumption and the reality, the gap between something will replace ISS and nothing is ready to replace ISS, is another manifestation of the same readiness gap we have been discussing all night. It is the gap between the future we talk about and the present we have funded, between the timeline we announce and the technology we have demonstrated, between the press conference and the post-flight inspection report. Part 10. Are we ready? Mars is 55 million miles away at its closest approach to Earth, and 250 million miles away at its farthest. A round trip using the most energy-efficient trajectory currently possible, a Hohmann transfer orbit, takes approximately 900 days. 2.5 years, 8.5 months of transit each way, with a surface stay of about 14 months in between while you wait for the planets to realign for the return journey. There is no free return trajectory to Mars. There is no abort to Earth option after the first few hours. There is no splashdown in the Pacific if things go wrong. If a toilet breaks on a Mars mission, you fix it or you improvise for 2.5 years. If a communication system fails, mission control is between 4 and 24 minutes away by radio, each way. If a valve in the service module needs a redesign, you will not be able to get the redesigned valve for approximately 26 months, which is the minimum interval between launch windows. I covered the full threat landscape of Mars in a previous video on this channel. The radiation lethality, the atmospheric hostility, the perchlorate soil toxicity, the planet-engulfing dust storms, the temperature extremes, the entry, descent and landing mass gap that no one has solved. If you have not seen that video, I would encourage you to watch it, because it lays out in detail why Mars is the most hostile destination humanity has ever seriously planned to visit. But tonight, I want you to think about Mars not as a destination but as a multiplier. Take every vulnerability that Artemis II revealed, every one we have discussed over the last 2 hours, and multiply it by the duration, the distance, and the isolation of a Mars mission. The heat shield. Artemis II's AV coat was worked around with a modified trajectory for a 10-day mission re-entering from the Moon at roughly 25,000 miles per hour. A Mars return re-entry would be at similar or higher velocities, with a crew that has been in space for over 1.5 years. The heat shield will need to work perfectly on the first attempt, with no second chance after months of exposure to the deep space environment. There will be no post-flight inspection to see if the workaround held. There will be one re-entry. It will either work or it will not. The radiation. 12 millisieverts in 10 days, 18% above models. Extrapolate that over 900 days. The Mars Curiosity rover's radiation detector measured surface radiation at roughly 0.64 millisieverts per day. If you add transit exposure, surface exposure, and the elevated risk of solar particle events over a 2.5-year period, the total mission dose approaches or exceeds NASA's 600 millisievert career limit. And that is using the models that Artemis II just showed underestimate reality by 18%. If the DELP cardiovascular data is correct, the first Mars crew may be signing up for a significantly elevated lifetime risk of heart disease, regardless of what their dosimeters read. There is a concept in systems engineering called coupled failure. It describes a situation where multiple systems, each individually reliable, are connected in ways that allow a failure in one system to cascade into failures in others. The heat shield does not exist in isolation from the trajectory. The trajectory does not exist in isolation from the propulsion system. The propulsion system does not exist in isolation from the service module valve that needs a redesign. The radiation exposure does not exist in isolation from the solar cycle, which does not exist in isolation from the mission timeline, which does not exist in isolation from the Starship HLS development schedule, which does not exist in isolation from congressional appropriations, which do not exist in isolation from geopolitical competition with China. Everything is coupled. Every decision about one system affects every other system, and the readiness gap is not a gap in any single system. It is a gap in our ability to see all the couplings at once, to understand how they interact, and to make decisions that account for the full complexity of what we are attempting. That is why I keep coming back to the phrase, the readiness gap, not the heat shield gap, not the radiation gap, not the institutional gap, the readiness gap. Because what Artemis II revealed is not a single problem with a single solution. It is a systems-level mismatch between the complexity of what we are trying to do and our current capacity to do it safely. The hardware is not quite ready. The biology is not fully understood. The institutions are running patterns that have been dangerous before, and the timelines are driven by factors that have nothing to do with readiness: politics, competition, budgets, public attention spans. I said at the beginning of this video that the terrifying truth was not that space is dangerous, and I want to come back to that, because I think it is the most important thing I can leave you with tonight. The terrifying truth is about us, about how we make decisions when the stakes are literally life and death, but the consequences are decades away, about whether we can build institutions that are honest about what they do not know, about whether we can resist the pressure to declare victory when the evidence says not yet. The Apollo program put 12 people on the moon in 3.5 years, from Apollo 11 through Apollo 17. It was one of the greatest achievements in human history, and the cardiovascular data, the 43% number, did not become visible until 4 decades later. The engineers who designed the Apollo spacecraft were brilliant. The managers who ran the program were dedicated. The astronauts who flew the missions were brave beyond measure, and none of them knew that the radiation they were flying through might be slowly damaging the blood vessels of the crew. The knowledge did not exist. The tools to detect it did not exist. The timeline between cause and effect was too long. We have more tools now. We have dosimeters that measure in real time. We have the DELP study. We have Vaughan's framework. We have 40 years of accident investigation that tells us exactly what the warning signs look like and exactly how organizations fail to heed them. We have every advantage that the Apollo and Shuttle programs did not. The question is whether we will use those advantages, whether we will look at the 18% radiation overshoot and say, we need to understand this before we send more people, whether we will look at the AVCOAT workaround and say, this solves the symptom but not the root cause, whether we will look at the Starship timeline and say, we will launch when it is ready, not when the calendar says we should, or whether we will do what the data says we usually do, celebrate the survival, normalize the deviation, fly again, the system failures, a $30 million toilet that broke on day 1 of a 10-day mission, a communication system that went one way after launch, software that crashed, a valve that needs a redesign. On a 900-day Mars mission, the compounding probability of system failures is not 10 times higher than a 10-day mission. It is exponentially higher. Redundancy helps, spares help, crew ingenuity helps. But no spacecraft in history has maintained continuous crewed operations for 900 days with 0 critical system failures. The International Space Station requires continuous resupply from Earth. A Mars-bound spacecraft will have whatever it launched with and nothing more, and the normalization of deviance, the most dangerous aspect of all, because it is the one that operates invisibly. If Artemis II's heat shield workaround becomes the baseline, and Artemis III flies it successfully, and Artemis IV flies it successfully, then by the time a Mars mission is being planned 10 or 15 years from now, the workaround will no longer be a workaround. It will be the standard operating procedure. The deviation will have been normalized. The engineers who originally flagged the AV coat problem will have retired or moved on. The institutional memory of why the trajectory was modified in the first place will have faded, and someone will propose flying the Mars re-entry on a trajectory that is slightly outside the modified envelope, because the mission requires it, because the timeline demands it, because we have always done it this way and it has always worked. That is the readiness gap at its most dangerous. Not a single failure but a slow accumulation, not a crisis but a gradient, not a decision but a drift. And I think that is what Artemis II really confirmed about our future in space. Not that we cannot do it. We can orbit the moon. We just proved that. We will almost certainly land on it again. We may eventually send people to Mars. The engineering talent is there. The ambition is there. The money, though it is never enough and always contested, is there. What Artemis II confirmed is that the gap between what we can do and what we can do safely is wider than the celebration suggests. It confirmed that our radiation models are imperfect by a meaningful margin. It confirmed that our systems fail at a rate that is manageable on short missions but concerning for long ones. It confirmed that our institutional patterns of risk acceptance, Patterns that have been documented, studied, and warned about for 40 years are alive and well, operating in real time in the decisions being made right now about the future of the Artemis program. Challenger's O-rings survived 24 flights. Columbia's foam survived 113 missions. The astronauts who flew beyond Earth's magnetosphere in the late 1960s and early 70s absorbed radiation that may have contributed to their deaths decades later, but nobody knew it at the time. Nobody could have known. The data did not exist, the sample was too small, the timeline was too long. We are at the beginning of another timeline now, the Artemis timeline, and this time we have Vaughan's work, we have Delp's study, we have the OIG reports and the ASAP warnings and the 18% radiation overshoot and the 100+ locations of char loss on Artemis I. We have all the early warning signs that previous eras did not have or did not heed. The question is whether we will use them, whether we will look at the data honestly and say, we're not as ready as we thought and we need to slow down until we are, or whether we will do what we have done before, celebrate the survival, normalize the deviation, accept the risk, and fly again. I do not know the answer. Nobody does. It has not been written yet. The crew of Artemis II is home. They are safe. They broke a record that stood for 53 years, and they brought back data that will shape the future of human spaceflight for decades to come. That is worth celebrating, genuinely and without reservation. But the data they brought back includes 12 millisieverts and an 18% overshoot. It includes a heat shield that has not been inspected yet. It includes a toilet that cost $30 million and broke on day one. It includes a landing timeline that just got pushed back, and a lander that has not passed its basic tests. And it includes, whether we acknowledge it or not, the continuation of a pattern that Diane Vaughan first identified 4 decades ago. A pattern that begins with early warning signs, proceeds through normalized deviance, and ends in one of two places, either a deliberate correction or a catastrophe. The terrifying truth that Artemis II just confirmed about our future in space is not that space is dangerous. Every child who has ever looked up at the stars knows that. The terrifying truth is that the gap between our ambitions and our readiness is not closing as fast as our timelines suggest. That the biological cost of deep space travel may be accumulating in ways we do not yet fully understand. That the institutional habits that have preceded every catastrophic failure in NASA's history are present in the decisions being made today. And that the choice between correction and catastrophe is not a choice that gets made once in a dramatic moment with cameras rolling. It is a choice that gets made every day, in every meeting, in every risk acceptance determination, in every decision to fly a workaround rather than fix the underlying problem. The Apollo astronauts went to the moon and came home heroes. The cardiovascular data came decades later, quietly, in an academic journal. The Challenger engineers warned about the O-rings for years before the disaster. The Columbia foam was documented on 113 flights before the final one. The warning signs are always there. The question is always the same. Are we willing to see them? The Artemis II crew is safe tonight. The capsule is being inspected. The data is being analysed. The next missions are being planned. And somewhere in a document that very few people will read, the numbers are telling a story that the press conference did not. 12 millisieverts, 18%, 104 locations of char loss, 43% cardiovascular mortality, 24 flights before Challenger, 113 before Columbia, 1 crewed flight of AV coat. The stars are not going anywhere. The question is whether we are ready to go to them honestly. And after tonight, I think you know that the honest answer is not yet, not quite. But maybe, if we are willing to listen to the data instead of the celebration, we're getting closer to being ready to admit that. And that, strange as it may sound, might be the most important thing Artemis II accomplished.